Do you know what happens when the person everyone dismisses is the only one telling the truth? The question seemed to hang in the air long before anyone realized how much it would matter. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta felt colder than usual that morning. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long golden lines across the polished floor, while the quiet murmur of attorneys, officers, and reporters echoed beneath the high ceiling. At the center of it all stood Major Naomi Carter, a black military police officer whose calm presence contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding the case. She wore a simple dark uniform with no visible decorations beyond her nameplate, and most people in the room barely glanced at her twice. To them, she looked like just another witness waiting to speak. Officer Ryan Mitchell saw her the same way. Leaning near the front row with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed, he watched her with a look that carried more judgment than curiosity. The hearing was supposed to be routine. A young black teenager had filed a complaint after an encounter that had sparked questions throughout the city. Community leaders filled several rows. Journalists adjusted cameras. The judge reviewed documents quietly from the bench. Yet beneath the formal atmosphere, something felt unstable, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Naomi could feel it in the room. She had spent years reading people under pressure. She had learned that fear had a sound, a rhythm, a silence. As her turn approached, she folded her hands together and stared ahead. The polished wood rail reflected the morning light. Somewhere behind her, a reporter whispered. A pen clicked. A chair shifted. Small sounds, ordinary sounds, but they seemed unusually loud. Then the prosecutor asked a simple question. Did anyone attempt to influence your testimony before today's hearing? The room became still. Naomi lifted her eyes. Her voice was calm, measured, impossible to mistake. Yes. A ripple moved through the audience. Ryan Mitchell's jaw tightened instantly. The prosecutor asked her to explain. Naomi took a breath. She wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about the teenager whose future depended on the truth. She was thinking about every person who had ever been told to stay quiet, because speaking up was inconvenient. The sunlight touched the edge of her shoulder as she began. I was approached and encouraged to change key details of what I witnessed. Several heads turned toward Ryan. Reporters immediately reached for notebooks. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ryan took a step forward. His expression darkened. The judge raised a hand for order, but the damage was already done. The hearing was no longer routine. Every eye in the courthouse was now fixed on Naomi Carter. She remained perfectly still, her posture steady, her voice unwavering. She knew what was coming. She knew powerful people rarely welcomed inconvenient truth. But she also knew something else. Before the day was over, this courtroom would discover exactly who she was, and nothing would ever feel routine again. The silence that followed her statement felt heavier than the marble walls surrounding the courtroom. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Even the reporters seemed to forget their keyboards as they stared at the woman standing at the witness stand with steady shoulders and calm eyes. Naomi Carter had spent most of her life becoming invisible when necessary. It was a skill she learned long before the military. Growing up on the south side of Atlanta, she had watched her mother work double shifts at a hospital and still come home with enough patience to help neighborhood children with homework. Her father had served 22 years in the Army and often reminded her that character revealed itself when nobody was watching. Those lessons followed her everywhere. They followed her through college, through military training, and through deployments thousands of miles from home. Years earlier, when many recruits struggled under pressure, Naomi had earned a reputation for staying calm during moments that caused others to panic. While some people raised their voices, she lowered hers. While others reacted emotionally, she focused on facts. That discipline eventually helped her become a major in the military police corps, responsible for investigations, security operations, and the welfare of soldiers under her command. Yet looking around the courtroom that morning, she could tell almost nobody knew any of that. To most observers, she was simply a black woman challenging a police officer whose version of events had already been repeated across television stations and newspapers. Ryan Mitchell understood exactly how appearances worked. He had built his reputation on confidence. For years, people accepted his explanations before asking questions. The badge on his chest carried weight. The uniform carried authority. But authority was different from truth, and Naomi knew the difference better than most. The prosecutor shuffled several documents before speaking again. Major Carter, can you tell the court when this conversation occurred? Naomi nodded. Her voice remained steady. 3 days before this hearing. A low murmur moved through the gallery. Ryan shifted his posture. His attorneys immediately exchanged nervous glances. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. Outside, sunlight reflected off nearby office buildings and flashed through the courthouse windows like brief streaks of gold. Inside, the atmosphere continued tightening. Naomi could feel dozens of eyes studying her face, searching for hesitation. They would not find any. She remembered the teenager at the center of the case. 17 years old. Frightened. Unsure whether anyone would believe him. She remembered promising herself that if she was called to testify, she would tell the complete truth regardless of consequences. Some promises cost more than others. This one might cost a great deal. The prosecutor asked another question. Were you offered anything in exchange for changing your testimony? The courtroom became quiet again. Naomi slowly looked toward the front of the room. Ryan Mitchell's expression hardened. A faint tension appeared around his eyes. For the first time that morning, he no longer looked confident. Naomi drew a slow breath and answered, yes. This time the reaction was immediate. Reporters reached for phones. Spectators leaned forward. Somewhere near the back row, someone whispered in disbelief. And as the judge called for order, Naomi realized the hearing had crossed a line from which there was no return. The truth was finally entering the room, and once it arrived, nobody would be able to send it away. The judge instructed the courtroom to remain quiet, but the tension had already spread through the room like electricity before a storm. Every person present seemed to understand that the hearing was no longer following the script anyone had expected. Naomi Carter stood with the same composed posture she had maintained since taking the stand. The polished wood beneath her fingertips felt cool. The faint scent of old paper and coffee drifted through the courtroom. Somewhere near the rear doors, a camera shutter clicked before a court officer signaled for silence. The prosecutor waited a moment before speaking again. Major Carter, can you explain exactly what was offered to you? Naomi nodded slowly. Her eyes moved briefly toward the judge before returning to the attorney. I was told that certain opportunities could become available if I adjusted my account of what happened. A murmur swept through the gallery. The words themselves sounded polite, but everyone understood their meaning. The prosecutor asked who had delivered that message. Before Naomi could answer, one of Ryan Mitchell's attorneys rose from his chair and objected. The sudden interruption echoed across the room. The judge listened patiently, then overruled the objection. The attorney sat back down, visibly frustrated. Naomi noticed Ryan staring at the table in front of him. Earlier, he had projected confidence. Now he seemed focused on avoiding eye contact. That small change did not escape the reporters. Pens moved rapidly across notepads. Phones glowed beneath the wooden benches. Outside the courthouse windows, clouds drifted across the Georgia sky, dimming the sunlight for a few moments before brightness returned. Naomi took a measured breath. She had spent years conducting investigations for the military police. She knew that truth often emerged through small details rather than dramatic revelations. A forgotten message, a missing report, a conversation someone assumed would never be repeated. The prosecutor continued carefully. Did you accept any offer? Naomi's answer came immediately. No. Several spectators exchanged looks. The response carried a quiet strength that was difficult to ignore. She was not speaking like someone seeking attention. She sounded like someone protecting a principle. The prosecutor nodded and asked why she refused. Naomi paused for only a second. Her father's voice surfaced in her memory. She remembered standing beside him as a teenager during a Veterans Day ceremony. He had pointed toward the American flag and said that honor only mattered when it cost something. If it was easy, everyone would choose it. Looking around the courtroom now, Naomi understood exactly what he meant. Because the truth belongs to the people affected by what happened, she said calmly, not to the people who benefit from changing it. The room became silent again. Even the reporters stopped typing for a moment. Near the front row, a community advocate slowly lowered her head. The judge studied Naomi carefully. Ryan Mitchell shifted in his chair. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared across his face. Naomi could see it clearly. The hearing was still far from over, but the balance inside the courtroom had begun to change. Authority was no longer controlling the conversation. Facts were, and facts had a way of revealing things that power could not hide forever. The prosecutor allowed a few seconds to pass before approaching the evidence table. The movement seemed small, but every person in the courtroom followed it with their eyes. A thick folder was placed on the polished surface beneath the bright overhead lights. The judge glanced toward it. Reporters shifted forward. Ryan Mitchell sat motionless, though the tension in his shoulders had become impossible to hide. Naomi Carter watched quietly from the witness stand. Years of military service had taught her that people often revealed more through silence than through words. The prosecutor opened the folder and removed several printed pages. The sound of paper sliding across would echoed softly through the room. "Major Carter," he said, "when you refused to alter your statement, what happened next?" Naomi folded her hands together. Her voice remained calm. The pressure increased. The courtroom grew still. Outside, traffic moved through downtown Atlanta, but inside the federal building the world seemed suspended. The prosecutor asked her to explain. Naomi looked briefly toward the jury box reserved for public oversight observers. Then she answered, "I receive calls, messages, suggestions that continuing to cooperate would create unnecessary problems." Several spectators exchanged uneasy looks. The judge made a note. Ryan's legal team immediately objected again, but the objection was quickly addressed and the questioning continued. The prosecutor lifted one of the documents from the folder. "Is this one of the messages you received?" Naomi studied the page. "Yes." A projector screen near the front of the courtroom illuminated. The message appeared in large text for everyone to see. It contained no direct threat, no obvious violation, yet the meaning was unmistakable. It suggested that careers could become difficult, that opportunities could disappear, that silence would be the wiser path. A low murmur spread across the room. Naomi noticed several reporters exchanging looks. They understood what the audience understood. The language had been carefully chosen. Professional, polite, calculated. The prosecutor displayed another message. Then another. Each one painted a clearer picture than the last. None explicitly demanded dishonesty. Yet together they created a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Naomi remembered reading the first message late at night in her apartment. Rain had tapped against the windows. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside her laptop. She had stared at the screen for several minutes before closing it. Not because she was afraid, because she was disappointed. She had spent her life believing institutions became stronger when people told the truth. Seeing someone attempt to avoid accountability felt like watching a crack spread through a foundation she respected. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor placed the final document on the screen. This time, even the spectators in the back rows leaned forward. The message referenced information that had never been released publicly. Information connected directly to the teenager's account of what happened. The room became completely silent. The judge slowly removed his glasses. Ryan Mitchell looked toward his attorneys, but none of them appeared eager to speak. For the first time that day, the balance of power inside the courtroom shifted visibly. Naomi could feel it. The facts were beginning to connect. The fragments were becoming a picture. And as sunlight returned through the tall courthouse windows, illuminating the evidence table in a warm golden glow, it became clear that the truth was no longer standing alone. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed completely. What began as a hearing now felt like a reckoning. The polished benches were filled with people who had arrived expecting a familiar outcome, but certainty was slowly disappearing from every corner of the room. Naomi Carter remained composed in the witness stand, yet she could feel the weight of attention pressing against her from all directions. The prosecutor stepped away from the evidence table and approached the center of the courtroom. His movements were deliberate, careful. He understood that every word mattered now. The judge watched silently while another document was placed on the screen. Unlike the previous messages, this one contained a timeline, dates, locations, communication records, small details that seemed insignificant alone but became impossible to ignore when viewed together. A reporter in the front row lowered her notebook and stared at the screen. A community leader folded his arms. Even several officers seated near the back appeared uncomfortable. The prosecutor turned toward Naomi. "Major Carter, after receiving these messages, did you report them?" "Yes," she answered. Immediately, the response echoed through the room. The prosecutor nodded. "To whom?" Naomi named a federal oversight office responsible for reviewing allegations involving public officials. Another murmur spread through the audience. The significance was obvious. She had not waited. She had not negotiated. She had not tried to protect herself. She had followed procedure from the beginning. Ryan Mitchell shifted in his chair again. His confidence seemed to shrink with every passing minute. The judge noticed it. Everyone noticed it. Outside, dark clouds drifted across the city skyline. Shadows moved across the courthouse windows before sunlight returned once more. The changing light painted the courtroom floor in alternating bands of silver and gold. Naomi glanced briefly toward the teenager seated beside his family. He looked nervous. His hands were clasped tightly together. For a moment their eyes met. She offered the smallest nod. Nothing dramatic, just reassurance. A reminder that he was not facing the room alone anymore. The prosecutor requested permission to introduce another piece of evidence. The judge agreed. A digital display appeared on the screen. Call records, timestamps, contact histories. Several names had been redacted, but one detail immediately captured attention. The communication activity intensified after Naomi refused to alter her account. The pattern was unmistakable. The room grew so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning system became audible. Ryan's attorneys began whispering urgently among themselves. Papers moved. Pens scratched across legal pads. Yet none of it changed what everyone could see. Facts were building on top of facts. Naomi felt a strange calm settle over her. Not satisfaction. Not victory. Something quieter. The feeling that comes when truth finally begins standing on its own feet. She remembered her father telling her that integrity often feels lonely before it feels meaningful. Looking around the courtroom, she finally understood. The judge leaned forward and reviewed the latest evidence carefully. His expression hardened. The hearing would continue, but one reality had become impossible to deny. The story that many people had accepted without question was beginning to unravel, thread by thread, under the weight of its own contradictions. The judge called for a brief recess, and the courtroom slowly exhaled for the first time all day. Conversations remained hushed. No one seemed eager to speak above a whisper. Naomi Carter stepped away from the witness stand and moved toward a narrow hallway outside the courtroom. The polished floor reflected the afternoon light pouring through a row of tall windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. For several moments, she stood alone. The distant sounds of elevators opening and closing drifted through the building. Somewhere below, traffic moved steadily through the city streets. Life continued outside these walls, unaware of the tension unfolding inside them. Naomi rested one hand against the cool stone ledge beneath the window and looked out across the skyline. Gray clouds had begun breaking apart, allowing shafts of sunlight to spill across rooftops and glass towers. The city looked peaceful from this height. She drew a slow breath. Her heartbeat had finally settled into a steady rhythm. Throughout her military career, she had learned that the hardest moments were rarely the loudest ones. The difficult moments arrived afterward, when the noise faded and a person was left alone with their choices. She thought about the teenager sitting in that courtroom. She thought about his family. She thought about every witness who had ever remained silent because the cost of speaking felt too high. A soft sound interrupted her thoughts. Footsteps approached from the hallway behind her. When she turned, she saw the teenager's mother standing several feet away. The woman hesitated before speaking. Her eyes looked tired, the kind of tiredness that came from carrying worry for too long. "Thank you," she said quietly. Naomi did not answer immediately. The words seemed too small for everything the family had endured. Instead, she offered a gentle nod. The woman smiled faintly before returning toward the courtroom. Naomi watched her leave. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it stayed with her. Sometimes gratitude carried more weight than applause. The hallway fell silent again. Sunlight warmed the side of her face. She remembered sitting on the front porch with her father many years ago after returning from basic training. The evening air had smelled like fresh-cut grass and summer rain. He had told her that courage was often misunderstood. People imagined courage as something dramatic, something loud. But real courage, he said, was usually quiet. It looked like telling the truth when lying would be easier. It looked like standing still when pressure demanded movement. Looking through the courthouse window now, Naomi finally understood those words completely. The hearing was not over. Difficult moments still waited ahead. Yet for the first time all day, she felt something stronger than tension. She felt peace. Not because she knew what would happen next, but because she knew she had honored the promise she made to herself. Outside, sunlight continued breaking through the clouds, casting long golden reflections across the city, while inside the courthouse a deeper kind of clarity was beginning to emerge. When the recess ended, the courtroom filled more quickly than before. Word had spread through the building. Staff members who had no connection to the case quietly slipped into available seats. Reporters returned carrying fresh notes. Even the atmosphere felt different. The uncertainty that had dominated the morning was giving way to anticipation. Everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. Naomi Carter resumed her place with the same calm expression she had worn all day. Across the room, Ryan Mitchell appeared noticeably different. His shoulders were rigid. His eyes rarely left the table in front of him. The confidence that once seemed effortless now looked strained. The judge called the hearing back to order. Papers shuffled. Chairs settled. Then the prosecutor stood and announced that new evidence had been approved for immediate review. A large monitor near the front of the courtroom illuminated once again. Several people leaned forward instinctively. Naomi watched without moving. She had not seen this evidence before. The screen displayed a series of official records obtained through a federal request. Dates appeared. Locations appeared. Internal communications appeared. At first, the information seemed routine. Then a timeline emerged. The prosecutor carefully connected each document to the next. A pattern began taking shape. The teenager's original statement matched surveillance records. The surveillance records matched dispatch logs. The dispatch logs matched communication records already entered into evidence. One fact reinforced another. One detail confirmed the next. The room grew steadily quieter. The prosecutor approached the final document. "Your Honor," he said, "this record was verified by 2 independent agencies this morning." The judge nodded. The screen changed again. This time a certified report appeared showing that key information had been omitted during the original review process. Several gasps echoed through the courtroom. Reporters immediately reached for their phones. One attorney closed his eyes briefly. Another lowered his head. Naomi felt her pulse quicken for the first time all day. Not from fear, from realization. The truth had finally reached the point where it could no longer be dismissed as opinion. The evidence was no longer asking questions. It was providing answers. The judge reviewed the report carefully. His expression became increasingly serious. Ryan Mitchell looked toward the screen and then away again. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, illuminating floating particles of dust above the wooden benches. The silence felt enormous. Then the judge placed the report on the bench and looked directly across the courtroom. "The record before this court has changed substantially," he said. His voice was measured, but every word carried weight. A wave of emotion moved through the spectators. Some appeared relieved. Others stunned. The teenager sitting beside his family lowered his head and covered his face with both hands. His mother reached for his shoulder. Naomi watched quietly. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply sat still as the truth finally stood in the center of the room, undeniable and fully visible. After months of doubt, pressure, and resistance, the facts had spoken for themselves. And for the first time that day, it became clear that the story everyone thought they understood had never been the real story at all. The hearing continued into the late afternoon, but the energy inside the courtroom had changed from confrontation to reflection. The evidence had spoken clearly, and now people were beginning to confront what that truth meant. The judge reviewed several final statements before addressing the room. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who understood the weight of the moment. Procedures would continue. Additional reviews would follow. Accountability would move through the proper channels. Yet everyone present understood that something larger had already happened. A narrative that once seemed settled had been overturned by facts and integrity. Naomi Carter remained seated quietly. Reporters occasionally glanced in her direction, expecting some visible reaction, but she offered none. She had not come seeking recognition. She had come to tell the truth. Across the courtroom, Ryan Mitchell sat in silence. The tension that had defined his posture throughout the day appeared replaced by something heavier. Reflection, regret, perhaps both. For the first time, he looked less concerned with defending himself and more concerned with understanding the consequences of the choices that had brought him here. As the proceedings slowed, the teenager at the center of the case stood beside his family. Relief softened his expression. His mother wiped away tears she had been holding back for months. His younger sister reached for his hand and refused to let go. Naomi noticed the small gesture and felt a quiet warmth in her chest. Families carried burdens together, even when the world could not see them. A few minutes later, the judge dismissed the session for the day. Chairs shifted. Conversations resumed in low voices. People began gathering documents and personal belongings. The room that had felt frozen by tension only hours earlier slowly returned to life. Naomi collected her notes and prepared to leave. Before she reached the exit, she heard someone call her name. Turning, she found Ryan standing several feet away. The distance between them seemed larger than the physical space separating them. For a moment, neither spoke. The courthouse lights reflected softly against the polished floor. Finally, Ryan lowered his eyes. His voice lacked the certainty it once carried. "I should have listened sooner." The words were simple. No excuses. No arguments. Just an acknowledgement. Naomi studied him for a moment. She could have responded with anger. She could have listed every difficulty that followed his decisions. Instead, she remembered something her father often said. Justice and bitterness were not the same thing. One repaired damage. The other only spread it. "Then listen now," she replied gently. "Not to me. To the people who were affected." Ryan nodded slowly. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply stood there in silence. Then Naomi turned and walked toward the courthouse doors. Behind her, conversations continued. Ahead of her, sunlight streamed through the glass entrance, bright and warm after a long day. The truth had prevailed, but what mattered most was not who had won. What mattered was that someone had finally been heard. The courthouse steps glowed beneath the soft light of early evening as Naomi Carter stepped outside and paused for a moment beneath the open sky. The air felt different now, lighter. The city moved around her with its usual rhythm. Cars rolled through intersections. Pedestrians crossed busy streets carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed briefly before fading into the sounds of Atlanta. Yet after everything that had happened inside the courthouse, the ordinary sounds felt meaningful. Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag and began walking toward the sidewalk. She had taken only a few steps when she noticed the teenager and his family standing near a row of stone planters. They were waiting, not for reporters, not for cameras, for her. The young man approached first. The uncertainty that had shadowed his face for months seemed gone. In its place was something steadier. Confidence. He extended his hand. Naomi shook it warmly. No speeches followed. No dramatic words. Sometimes gratitude was strongest when expressed simply. His mother smiled through tired eyes. His sister offered a small wave. Then the family continued toward their car, staying close together as they disappeared into the evening crowd. Naomi watched them leave. A faint breeze moved through the street, lifting a few fallen leaves across the pavement. Above the courthouse entrance, the American flag shifted gently against the fading blue sky. She remembered another flag years earlier on a military base overseas. She remembered standing at attention beside soldiers from every background imaginable. Different stories, different lives, one purpose. In those moments, she had learned that dignity was not something another person could give or take away. It came from the choices people made when circumstances became difficult. Her phone vibrated softly. A message appeared from one of her former commanders. The text was short. "Proud of you." Naomi smiled, not because she needed the approval, but because it reminded her that integrity never truly went unnoticed. It simply moved more quietly than everything else. The sunlight continued sinking behind the buildings, painting the windows downtown in shades of gold and amber. Naomi crossed the street and stopped briefly at the corner. Behind her, the courthouse stood tall and silent. Ahead of her, the city stretched toward the horizon. New challenges would come. New obstacles would appear. That was life. But today had proven something important. Truth did not need to shout to be powerful. It only needed someone willing to carry it. Naomi slipped her phone into her pocket and continued walking. Her footsteps blended with the sounds of the city. The breeze brushed gently against her uniform. Above her, the evening sky deepened into shades of orange and blue. She never looked back at the courthouse. She did not need to. The lesson had already been written. Character mattered more than status. Courage mattered more than comfort. And kindness, even in the face of injustice, remained one of the strongest forms of strength a person could possess. As the last light of day settled across the city, Naomi disappeared into the crowd, while the flag above the courthouse continued to move quietly in the wind.